Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel and to another video. In this one we are going to be going through another watercolor painting, and I'm going to be walking you through how I painted this beautiful lavender field using watercolors. In particular though, I'll be focusing on one technique that I used for this painting to add the highlights at the end. And this technique is really useful to add bright opaque highlights on top of your watercolor paintings that will make them pop so much more. Here you can see the painting before I use this technique and afterwards, and you can see that there is a clear difference. So let's start off by running through my process for how I got my painting to that first picture that I showed you, and then I'll go through this trick that I do to add highlights, because highlights can be really difficult to add on top of watercolor. It's not very easy to add brighter watercolors on top of darker layers of watercolor, so I think this trick will be really useful for you guys. So I always start out by mixing my colours up first, and I'm going to be using the wet on wet technique first in this painting tutorial, and so I especially like mixing up my colours first before wetting the paper, because if I was to wet the paper first for the wet on wet technique and then mix the colours, by the time I'd mixed up all of these colours the paper would have probably dried out. So I only am using a couple of colours, mainly a few shades of purple, green, and then for the sky I've got a yellow, a pink and a blue tone. Now once I mixed up all of my colours, I took a large paintbrush and I'm just wetting the whole of my paper surface. Every corner, every edge, you want to make sure that you don't miss out any part of the paper. And I will list out all of the materials that I'm using in the description below if you want to check them out. And then once your paper is nicely wet, you don't want it to be too wet and have puddles of water, but you want to have a nice layer of water on the surface of the paper so that it's nice and glistening. I then go and I add in the colours, starting off with the sky, and like I said, I'm using yellow, pink and blue/purple tones for the sky. And right around where the sun is in the middle, I want to directly add yellow around the sun, leaving the sun white so that it has the brightest glow. And then from the yellow, I gradient into the pink and then the blue at the outer corners and edges of the painting. Now for this particular reference image, there was an aisle of really short grass in between the two columns of lavender. So I'm just taking my lightest green and I'm just adding a wash of that light green in the middle aisle there, and also I'm dotting a bit of the green throughout where the lavender bushes are, because you can see some tall grass within those areas. I then take my purple and I start to tap in where the clusters of lavender are. I'm looking to see in the reference where the lavender is nice and dense, and because we're using the wet on wet technique, everything will bleed out and soften out, so you don't need to use lots of details and add lots of details in this layer. We're just trying to establish the basic colours for each area. We're trying to get a feel for where the grass is and where the lavender is, and then in the next layers we can build up more details. So I do generally like to start off with a wet on wet layer, and I use this layer to start to establish those colours and block them in. I like to start with the lighter colours, and as you can see I'm building up to using those darker greens for the shadows. And you want to make sure that you work fairly quickly when you're doing a wet on wet layer, otherwise the paper can start to dry and you might get harsh edges or cauliflower effects forming. So if you notice that your paper is starting to dry and you haven't finished your layer, wait for it to completely dry and then pre-wet the paper again with some water and carry on. Otherwise you will get harsh edges if you try to do a wet on wet technique with dry paper. And that's why I really recommend mixing up your colours first. So once I'd done that wet on wet layer, I waited for the painting to completely dry and I start to work on the details now. First I'm going in with my lighter green that I used with the wet on wet background, and I'm using this colour to pull up some highlights for the grass and to add lots of little grass details all around the lavender. And especially in the front, the grass was very tall and very long. So the grass that I did further towards the front of the painting, I made sure was longer. And then towards the back, and as we get more in the distance, the grass was shorter and we couldn't see as much of it. We could only see the top of the grass. So I did shorter brush strokes as we got further back. And I made sure to do some grass coming and weaving in and out of the lavender, and then some coming over the top of the lavender. So I tried to add a variety, and I tried to make sure that I did my grass curving in the direction that it was in the reference image. I'm also using this time to build up more shadows throughout the green areas using that dark green. And I quite often like to go back and darken up values as I notice them. Moving on, now I'm using that purple tone to add in the details for the lavender. And when I paint in the lavender, I use a tapping motion to build up the shapes of each of the bits of lavender. I do my tapping motion thicker and fuller at the bottom, and then it gets more sparse at the top. Another great way to paint in lavender is using this sponge, and this is just a section of a washing up sponge that I tore off, and this is great for painting in expressive flowers or foliage or anything like that, because it creates these really random shapes and a really speckledy look that works really well at giving the impression of lavender. Especially in the reference like this, where all of the lavender is overlapping and it just sort of looks like a mass of lavender. This is great for giving that effect and adding nice texture to your painting. So all I do is I dip my sponge into the paint and just simply tap wherever I want the lavender to be. I also add some little details of lavender going over onto the sky to tie the lavender field in with the sky. And where the sun is, it casts a reddish orange glow at the top of the lavender field. So you can see that a lot of the details that I added on top of the sky, I did using that red tone. So once I've added in all of the details with the lavender, I decided that I wanted to go in and darken up the sky with the same colours, that yellow, that pink and that blue. I just wanted to intensify it and make it more saturated. So I just wet the sky again, and I'm going in and I'm tapping in some more yellow around the sun and some more pink and blue in the outer edge and outer corners. And this just helps to make the sky pop more and makes it look more vibrant. But I made sure to keep the sun white still. Now before we add in the highlights, if you want to learn how to improve your painting and drawing skills, over on my Patreon I have got over 300 real-time tutorials that you can access for just a small amount per month to help you level up your skills. For each tutorial you'll get access to the reference image, sketch outline and materials list, so you really can follow along with me every step of the way. But if a monthly membership isn't right for you, over on my website I have got lots of courses for each medium. So if you're just interested in focusing on one medium, then you can get access to one of my courses which will teach you all of the techniques you need to know to master painting or drawing. All of the tutorials in my courses are also in real time. One of the courses that I recommend you guys checking out is Expressive Animals in Watercolour. That really teaches you a lot of expressive watercolour techniques that are really fun to use and apply to your paintings. If you want to get any of my courses, you can get 15% off by using the code SAVE15 at checkout. So I'll leave a link to my Patreon and to my course website in the description below. But let's move on to this technique for adding highlights to your watercolour paintings. Now the trick for this is to add a tiny bit of gouache into your watercolours, and then you can make any colour that you want, and this will create really opaque, beautiful highlights. Now you may have seen that I go in and I use white gouache to add in some white highlights and some white splatters normally, but you might not always want to add white highlights. For example, with the lavender or with the grass, you may want to go in and add light purple highlights or light green, and you don't want all of your highlights to be white. So the trick for this is to get some of the colour, your watercolour that you want to use, onto your palette. So I'm using that purple colour. We're going to create some nice highlights on top of the lavender to really make the lavender pop and stand out, and to add depth and a layering effect to our painting. So you really want to get lots of that paint into your palette and just mix it in with a tiny bit of the white gouache. Now I'm using the Winsor & Newton permanent white gouache. You can use any white gouache that you want. And I really do recommend having a tube of this because it really does come in handy. And you want to make sure that you mix in enough watercolour until you get a nice light purple tone. You want to mix in enough gouache so that it is opaque enough to stand out on top of the watercolour, and try not to add too much water, because if you dilute this mixture too much, then again it will be very translucent, and when it dries it won't be opaque and it won't stand out and give you the brightest highlight. So only use a tiny bit of water and try to mix in enough gouache to make it nice and opaque as well. I'm also going to do the same thing for the green colour, so I'm getting that nice light green into my palette as well. And you do want to make sure that you have enough watercolour, because the gouache really will not dilute it but desaturate it and turn it really pale. So you want to have enough pigment down on your palette before you mix in the gouache. And I'm just taking a little bit of gouache on a clean brush and I'm just mixing it in with that green. And just a tiny bit of white gouache mixed in with your watercolours gives them that opaque property that they need to stand out on top of those darker watercolours. Because the white watercolour that you normally get in the palette isn't really that effective, and I've found that the white watercolour normally isn't very opaque, and so it doesn't stand out and isn't bright on top of your darker layers of watercolour. Okay, so make sure they're thoroughly mixed, and then you can use them to paint in some beautiful highlights, as I'm doing here. First with that purple, I'm going to paint in some lighter purple bits of lavender, and this helps to add a nice variety to your painting, and you don't have to worry about preserving all of those little highlights. You can just go in and paint, and you know that you have the freedom to paint in the highlights afterwards, which I think can make it really relaxing to paint because you don't have to worry about anything. And you can see how opaque and beautiful these highlights look. And like I said, the more gouache you mix in, the more opaque they'll be. But if you add in more water, then they will be more subtle and more translucent when they dry. And I'm just using the same technique to paint in the lavender, that tapping motion. And I make the lavender thinner at the ends. And you can do this with any colour that you want. As you can see, I've used it with the green to add a few little bits of grass. You can also use the sponge with this technique as well, and it works really well. And at the moment, the painting was kind of lacking those highlights, and if you don't have a good contrast in your painting, which basically means you need those highlights and shadows, and if you don't have bright highlights, then the painting won't pop as much as it could, it won't stand out, and it won't have as much depth to it. So just going in and tapping in a few of these brighter purple highlights really helps to give depth to this painting, I think. And so once I've gone in and added in the lavender, I'm going to go in and use the green to add in some little bits of grass further down the front. And this can be really useful when you want to add bits of grass that are overlapping that really dark shadowed colour. So where we've got those really dark green areas, it can be hard to get in these highlights, but using this technique, it's so easy, as you can see. I'm just going to go throughout the painting and add some of this tall grass. And what's great is you can add the grass overlapping the lavender, so overlapping that purple, and it will still show up great. So it will cover anything. I'm going to use it to add some highlights in the middle of the aisle, that short section of grass. And that is pretty much it for this painting and for this tutorial. I really hope you liked that little technique. Let me know if you want to try it out with your next watercolour painting. Here is the final result. Like I mentioned before, you can get the real-time tutorial for this painting over on my Patreon. Anyway guys, I really hope you enjoyed the video.
If you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you're new around here, and even tick that bell icon so you do get notified on my future videos. But that is it from me, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye everybody.